So we're continuing this series we began last week, and we started with Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and every passage kind of follows each other in this series. And that one kind of set up all the ones that follow. And Jesus there makes the claim, because he's come, and in Matthew's gospel, it starts off telling us the story of how he's come, and he says, I came to bring the kingdom, like the kingdom of heaven is here. And he starts announcing this kingdom. And lots of the teachers of religious law, the Pharisees, they went, well, this sounds kind of new to us. You're at odds with us. We're the ones that follow the Old Testament scriptures, and you're not true to that. And so Jesus makes this radical claim. He says, I'm in line with that, and not one of that bit of that will fall away. And I am living out the purpose and teaching you the purpose of what that law was about. And so for the rest of this series, it follows this pattern where Jesus says, you've heard this. And then he quotes the Old Testament law and maybe some interpretation that's given to it by the rabbis. And then he says, but I'm going to say to you this. And remember, because of what we learned last week, he's still claiming to be in league with the Old Testament law, the scriptures of the Old Testament. But he says, you've heard it this way. Let me kind of expound on that. Let me challenge the way that you understand that. And so you'll hear you have heard this, but I say that every week, so get used to that. And so we're starting this morning in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, right after the other passage. And so Jesus says, you have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, if you're even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. So if you're presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person. Then come and offer your sacrifice to God. When you're on your way to court with your adversary, settle your differences quickly. Otherwise, your accuser may hand you over to the judge, who will hand you over to an officer, and you will be thrown into prison. And if that happens, you surely won't be free again until you paid the last penny. So as I said, Jesus is always making these statements, and we're going to follow 6 of them in the next few weeks. And so he starts in dealing with these 6 statements. They're sometimes referred to as the antithesis, because he's saying, you've heard this, but I'm going to say something different. Not in conflict with it, you understand, because of what he prefaced it all with, but he's going to clarify some things. So he says, you have heard you must not murder. If you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. So you've heard that our ancestors were told, you must not commit murder. If you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. That's his statement, which I think we can all kind of get behind. I hope we can all get behind. It's not lost on me that I'm preaching this sermon on Mother's Day, and I know there are times for mothers, when they track their muddy boots across your floor, and that feeling wells up. Not that you would kill them, but, sometimes, right? So Jesus quotes this. It's quoted from Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. And it's words to live by. It's from the 10 Commandments, actually. It's commandment number 6. You don't murder anyone, which is good advice. I think we could all agree on it. Most people, even if they don't go to church, I hope would agree with it. And I think most would, if not all. And then he adds something. He says, if you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. That's not part of the commandment in the Old Testament law. It's not part of that part of Scripture. But the rabbis, in reading the entire of the Old Testament, there's scriptures there that do talk about the consequences of breaking the law. And in this case, there are consequences of judgment that are mentioned. So Jesus is quoting the 10 Commandments, and then he's saying, and I know you guys have heard too that there are consequences, that there's judgment involved in that, and you're subject to judgment if you break that. And so it's a common interpretation, and like I say, it's not a hard lesson to follow, to say, yeah, I've never murdered anyone, so I think I'm good. I've maybe had some feelings, but it's never elevated to that level. And so he's quoting that, and just to put a little more detail into it, in Hebrew there are 7 words for killing. And Exodus, the passage that Jesus is quoting, is using one of those words. In Genesis chapter 9, there's a word that means killing animals, and that's different than this word that we have translated as murder. And then there's one that's in Exodus chapter 22 that's about defending your home. So somebody breaks into your home and they're going to do you harm, and you defend yourself, and that kind of killing is not the same as murder. And then there are accidental killings where somebody is accidentally killed, and Deuteronomy chapter 19 talks about that and uses that word. And so that's not the same thing. And then there's execution of murderers by the state, capital punishment. That's not the same thing as murder. They don't use the same word for that. And then there are certain types of wars in Scripture that have a word for them. And it's not that word. Jesus chooses the same word as the commandment. And that specific word, rasa, means murder. So, and it includes premeditation, like you thought about it. It wasn't like just a reaction. You thought about what you're going to do, and there was a deliberateness to it. You did it on purpose. That guy, that person has done something, said something, and you go after them with murderous intent. And incidentally, it also applies to suicide. That's in Scripture, that's self-murder. And it says that's part of murdering. And so if you kill yourself, it's the same as killing somebody else. And then there's the people who are an accessory to murder, and they would also be considered murderers, according to this definition. So Jesus says, you've heard that you shouldn't murder. And we go, yeah, that's good. But then he says, but I say, if you're even angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell. And so here's the thing. If I was to ask you, how many people feel like they could keep that command of not murdering someone? Show of hands. I'm getting a little scared. Some people didn't put their hand up. I think I'm not going to say anything controversial from now on, just in case. But yeah, so I think even if you didn't put your hand up, I know. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you're not a murderer, and that you're not thinking about killing anybody at this very moment and making a plan. And so when you ask for that kind of question, when that is posed, when Jesus quotes that, most people who are hearing that would go, yeah, okay, that's a reasonable request, that I not murder anyone. I think I can get behind that. Lots of people who don't go to church or don't believe in anything about God would say, yeah, I could even obey that one. Yeah, I don't go around killing people. Don't murder anyone. And so we wouldn't have to think about it. No one would have to hesitate in answering the question. Even if they didn't put up their hand, your brain went, well, yeah, of course I don't kill anybody. But if I asked, have you ever been angry with someone? Have you ever called someone an idiot? You ever curse someone? And curse means like treat them like they're empty-headed. I'm not going to single out the moms that time. But have you ever done those things? I think a few more people would be squirming in their seats, right? You're going, wait a minute. And so there's this tension that gets built because you kind of go, was that really what Jesus meant? Is he really saying that? If it wasn't Jesus and somebody said, murder, that's pretty much the same thing. Let me add to that. Let me put it in the same context and say, you shouldn't murder, but if you're angry with someone, kind of the same thing, kind of falls along the same lines. If you call someone an idiot, we'd go, if it wasn't Jesus, we would go, what kind of snowflake is this? Like, didn't you learn in school, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me, right? We teach our kids that, and we go, like, just ignore them, they'll go away, and you shouldn't be so soft that you can't take insults from people, just blow it off, and it isn't as serious, of course, as as murder. So why would Jesus, in talking about murder and talking about obeying this law of murder, say, you may say that, you've heard that, but I'm going to say something else. And is that in conflict with that? Is it in addition to that? Are you kind of making a comparison? It sounds like you're going a little too far. And so I'm guessing that we kind of have to think about it, and we might hesitate a little more and squirm, and maybe we're starting to qualify in our minds. Well, what do you mean by angry? Like what qualifies as that kind of anger Jesus is talking about? Maybe, are you just talking if I feel that way at all? Like if I feel anything against anybody, then I'm violating this in some way? What does anger really mean in that way? It can't be just any kind of feeling that way. What are we talking about? Does it count if I felt anger and I didn't act on it? Like I didn't do anything? I didn't say anything? Like I just pushed it down and ignored it or even fought it off? Like does that count? And what if I said, have you ever called somebody an idiot? Have you ever called somebody a moron? Have you ever cursed someone? Then you might be thinking, what if I used a different insult? Right? I'm very creative. I don't usually call them an idiot, but I call them stuff, So as long as I'm not using that word, I'm okay. What if I use a different one that insults somebody's intelligence? And what if the person really, really is an idiot? Like, is that okay? Maybe I'm not calling them an idiot. They're an idiot. I'm just acknowledging reality. That person's an idiot. What about that? Is that okay? Has Jesus got an issue with that? So we got to grapple with it a little more. Jesus doesn't make it easy. Newsflash, sometimes he really doesn't make it easy to figure out what he's talking about. And so as we look at this, as we understand the commandment, and Jesus not letting us off the hook that easy, that we just don't kill anybody, and says this stuff about anger and calling people an idiot and cursing people, what is he driving at? What's he really doing? Is he comparing anger and name-calling to murder? And why does it matter to Jesus if we think and say someone's an idiot? Why does it matter to him if we get angry with people? And so to understand that, what we got to do is understand what he said before he's launched into these 6 statements, this being one of them, is he said that I'm not gonna conflict with the Old Testament. Like, you think I might be abandoning our religion and our beliefs and what God said about himself in the Old Testament. I'm not. I'm fully in line with that. I'm here to fulfill its purposes. And so when he quotes it and then he says this about it, he's trying to drill down to something deeper that it actually means and where it comes from and why. And so for that, you got to go back to the beginning of the scriptures, the beginning of the Bible, book of Genesis. The very first story is the story of creation. And you got God making the sky and the earth and the sea and the land and the fish and the birds and the animals. And then last thing, on day 6, before he finishes making stuff, he makes human beings, people like us. And so we're told in the story that as it unfolds, God has this conversation basically with himself. There's one God, but 3 persons in that Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he says, let us make man in our image. Like, they're talking to each other, and we get in on the dialogue, and they go, let's make mankind, let's make human beings, and we're going to make them in our image. We're going to make them like God. So each human being is created with the image of God on them. Who they are, their deepest identity is that they're made in the image of God. There are ways that they reflect who God is just by being a human being. And so Jesus, when he says what he's saying, he's looking back at that and trying to help them understand what that meant, and that gives light to it. And so humans are made in the image of God, and that's actually the reason you don't go around killing people, is because people have dignity. They have worth. They are worth more than that. So you don't treat human life cheaply, because the people themselves are different than just killing an animal. That's a person, and the person has value to us as believers because they have the image of God on them. Every single human being, no matter how they're living or who they are or the decisions they make or the things they say or what they do. They are made in the image of God, no exceptions. And then if you move a little further into the scriptures, you find that as the story of God's interaction with human beings unfolds, that people are constantly given new names. And so there's a guy named Abram. And Abram is like the father of the people of God, the nation of Israel. And so when God's setting up a people for himself, he tells Abram, he says, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make you a blessing to everybody. I'm going to teach you and your descendants, and they're going to be as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. And he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you as a family to know me and to know what I'm about and to live the way I want human beings to live and treat each other the way I want you to treat each other. And that's going to spread so that there's a blessing to everybody on the planet. And anybody who's paying attention, they'll be blessed by that because they'll start to understand what I've taught them, how to be my people and how to live the way I want them to live. And so God changes Abram's name to Abraham, and the meaning of the name Abraham is father of many nations. And there's kind of a symmetry to it because he changes Abram's wife's name too. Her name is Sarai, and he changes her name to Sarah, and Sarah means mother of many nations. So he sets them up and says, this is what I'm going to do with your descendants. You're going to have them. There's going to be a huge family tree come from your lineage, and they're going to be my people, and I'm going to teach them. I'm going to grow this culture where they act in such a way, and they treat each other in such a way, and they're in relationship in such a way that the rest of the world will get a glimpse of me. And they will understand that you're living out of that place where you're made in the image of God in such a way that maybe it will challenge their perception of who they are and what their identity is, and tell them that they are a person made in the image of God and they have dignity and worth and a sense of purpose because of that. And if they are willing to open their eyes and see it, they'll recognize that in what you're doing. And then one of Abraham's descendants, Jacob, his name is changed to Israel because Israel was the name of the nation, and so he gets a new name. And then Moses, who wrote down the law, it's thought, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Moses gets in on the name change game, and he's got one of his proteges, one of the young leaders in the tribe of Israel named Hoshea, and Moses decides that name doesn't fit anymore. There's a better name for this guy, and he changes his name, and you might recognize him by his other name, Joshua, or Yeshua. And so Joshua gets a new name because he's got a different role. And so Joshua, the guy who marched around the wall of Jericho and it fell down, right? And so Joshua means Jehovah saves. And God's doing this thing where he's trying to save the planet, save the people of the earth. And then there's Simon, who is one of Jesus' followers, and he gets his name changed to Peter by Jesus. And Jesus says, I'm going to name you Peter, or the rock, because I'm going to build my church on you. And then some people believe Saul, right? Saul, who got his name changed to Paul, and he becomes, he writes 2/3 of the New Testament. But when he's Saul, he was a Pharisee. He was a guy who really took the scriptures so seriously, but was sure that Jesus was in conflict with it, that he went around persecuting Christians. And Saul then becomes known as Paul. But what actually happened is Saul is his Hebrew name, and he would have leaned into and used his Hebrew name because that was his purpose. That was his identity. I'm one of those guys, part of the people of God, and that's how I live. And then when he met Jesus, Jesus appeared to him on the Damascus Road and challenges the fact that he's fighting everything Jesus taught. Jesus was already dead and buried and risen into heaven, and Jesus appears to him and says, why are you persecuting me? And he says, who are you? And he says, I'm Jesus. And then Saul, changes his whole outlook on life. And because he's a Roman citizen, he also has this Roman name, Paul, that he wasn't really going by. But as Jesus gives him his purpose in life, he sends him out to all the Gentiles, to all the non-Jews, to spread the message beyond the people of God. Because remember, he told Abraham he's going to spread it from the very beginning. So he sends Paul out, and he starts using his Roman name because he's not just dealing with Israelites anymore. He knows it's worldwide, that God loves everybody. So he starts using a name that would have been more common and probably bad associations with Saul. Like when I was Saul, I killed Christians for being Christians, so I'm going to just go by a new name and start over and be a new person. So why do I tell you those two stories? Why do we talk about, well, of course, it applies to murder that we've got the image of God on us. But what does this really have to do with what Jesus said about it? Well, here's the thing. If you see people as made in the image of God, that has certain inferences for how you're going to treat those people. If you see them as having the image of God on them, that you see their deepest identity, who they really are is a person made in the image of God, then you're going to treat them a certain way. You're going to speak to them a certain way. You're going to value them a certain way. And Jesus is saying, it's going to mean more than just you don't kill them. Like the thing that makes you not kill them is because they have worth and value. And that's the same reason you don't go around blasting them with your anger. So he's not talking about just having feelings, but he says, like, when you've got that level of anger, that inappropriate anger where someone, it becomes something kind of subhuman to you. They're not that person anymore. They're just that guy. The one, I can't stand them. And you look at everything as if they're a horrible, horrible person. And you don't treat them as if they matter in any way. And so Paul in Ephesians, in teaching the way of Jesus, and the fact that it has implications about anger, he says, don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. He goes, like, the purposes of evil are played out if you let anger have such a way with you. It's not that you have the feelings, but that if you sin by letting anger control you, if anger becomes your motivating force in how you're responding to the world and responding to people that are even your enemy, he says that's a problem for Jesus. Like, what we're supposed to do is view them as valuable and with dignity. Even if they're not treating us with dignity and respect, we, because of the way we look at them, should treat them with dignity and respect. And we live in a world that is very caught up in these kind of things. And so especially when we look at people, Jesus says, it's more than just don't kill them. If you give a foothold to the devil, if you look at them with anger, and in your mind you're not treating them like a person made in God's image anymore, you're forgetting for a moment that they have worth and value and dignity just by being human, and you start to act out of your anger more than out of your view of who they are as a person made in the image of God, that's a problem. And it's subject to judgment. And then he says, if you're angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. He says, if you call someone an idiot, you're in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in the dangers of fire and hell. Well, if names matter, and the Israelites thought names really do matter, to the point where sometimes if your destiny unfolds and you have this purpose because of the way that you're following God and you're living a certain way, sometimes your name doesn't fit anymore and we need to change your name. Names mattered to them. Now, some of us, we look for our baby names and we thought, okay, let me look up what it means and I really want to, some of us just go, well, that name sounds cool, right? And it doesn't matter. It's not a big deal to us. But in their culture, it really mattered what their name was, to the point where if their name didn't fit anymore, they got a new name from God or from someone around them, someone who was part of the people of God. And so names would change because you changed. Your name mattered. It should line up with who you are. So when Jesus says, if you call someone an idiot, he's saying, if you look at that person and you strip them of their name, their identity in their name, and you put this identity as just an idiot, just a moron, just an empty-headed person, you are stripping them of their value and their worth and their dignity as a human being. And we live in a world where people talk a lot about how they identify and how they see themselves and how they view themselves and who they are. And they have all kinds of ideas about that. And sometimes some of those ideas are like dead wrong. And we as Christians, instead of trying to fight them on what they think of themselves, if we are going to live in the Jesus way, we're going to look at them and say, what I'm going to believe about you and what I'm going to treat you like and how I'm going to respond to you is that you have dignity and you have worth. And you are somebody worthy of my love and my care because you are made in the image of God who I serve. And so our radical response is not to bludgeon them into submission to our ideology or what we believe, but we are going to be true to what we believe, even if they're not. We're going to see them that way, even if that's not the primary way they see themselves. So whatever confusion they have about who they are, we know that the most important thing about them is that they're made in God's image and deserve dignity. And so Jesus says, look, if you start calling people names and you start seeing them as other than a real person and a valuable person who God loves and cares about their eternal destiny, if you stop seeing them that way and you start to just see them as your opponent and as the enemy, that's a problem for him. Jesus wants us to know that the reason we don't murder is not just because we're told not to. It's the biblical reason behind that. The reason and the rationale is because we see them made in God's image. And it should change more than whether we kill somebody or not. It changes how we view them and how we treat them and how we live in relationship with other people. So then Jesus spells out 2 examples. He says, that's true, here's why it goes deeper than just not murdering them. You don't let yourself be motivated by anger in how you view them, and don't be calling them names and make them subhuman in some way and treat them as less than people made in the image of God if you're going to be true to my kingdom. And then he gives them 2 examples. He says, so if you're presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, you suddenly remember someone has something against you. So they got something against you, not you have something against them. Leave your sacrifice there at the altar and go and be reconciled to that person, and then come and offer your sacrifice to God. He says, even if it's somebody else's beef with you and you're not trying to do that, if you're coming to worship and you're going to worship God, he says, before you go in and do your rituals in worship, before you go sing your songs, before you go tell God how sorry you are for the mistakes you've made, go fix stuff with that person that you're at odds with. If it's in your power, be reconciled to them. Do what you can to fix that. Don't come in and just do this and then go back out into the world and just live the same. He says, fix it first. The priority is the relationship to other people who are made in the image of God, and that's everyone. And so the psalmist says, if I had not confessed the sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. He says, look, there's no point in going in and telling God how much you love him if you walk around treating people who are made in his image really shabbily, and you look at them as subhuman, and you don't view them through his eyes and see how much they matter to him. And then he gives another example. He says, example 2, when you're on your way to court with your adversary, so your enemy, right? And then he says, settle your differences quickly. Otherwise, your accuser may hand you over to the judge, who will hand you over to an officer. You'll be thrown into prison, and if that happens, you surely won't be free again until you've paid the last penny. In their court system, if you had a beef with somebody, if you were suing somebody or they were suing you, and so somebody's suing you for something, they've got a beef against you, and they're taking you to court over it, he says, settle your if you can work it out before you get to court, even better. And here's why. In their system, why he says this about you won't be able to pay if you owe them money and you'll be thrown into prison until you pay. Here's the problem. If you couldn't pay someone because you didn't have the money yet, if you couldn't pay them off or refuse to pay them off, you get thrown into prison until you pay it. But if you get thrown into prison, you owe money and you don't have any money, newsflash, you can't earn any money in prison to pay them off. So now you don't even have a way to pay them off if you wanted to. And so people would get stuck in prison, and they'd be in there till they pay the last penny, but they can't make any money. And they were already in trouble before, but now they're really stuck, and they don't have a way to pay it back. And so they could spend the rest of their lives in jail. And he goes, look, work things out. If relationship is important, if how you treat people is important, try to sort it out. Don't be so standing on, I'm right and they're wrong and all of that. Just be conscious that if you can fix it, even if it's not your fault, Put in the work. And you'll save yourself that situation you get in where you're just angrier and angrier, and other stuff kind of makes you feel like you're the victim, and you're fighting things out so much that you're tempted to start to treat people like they're subhuman. And so the Apostle Paul talks about that when he says to them that they shouldn't really, that you don't let the sun go down on your anger, right? That thing, he says, like, don't let the devil have a foothold. Like, don't give a situation where you're in danger of drifting into that kind of anger where you're so mad and you're so upset that you're name-calling and you're dehumanizing them. And in your mind, they're just that person that, and not a person worthy of respect and dignity. And it doesn't matter how they're acting. They don't earn the dignity. They have it automatically because they're made in the image of God. And they may not act like it, but we need to act like it. If they're acting that way because they don't believe that, if we really believe this stuff that Jesus is saying, then we live by it even when nobody else does. And that's why Jesus teaches them stuff like love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. That's weird stuff. That's out of step with our time. It doesn't fit in our world and our sense of justice. But Jesus says that's how you do it, because hopefully they will catch on and they will understand their worth and your worth in the same way, by seeing the way that you act, because you are acting as if that's true, that every human being has worth and dignity and value, not because of them, but because of what he did when he created them. And if we see them that way, if we believe Jesus when he tells us, if we believe the Old Testament scriptures, then Jesus says we will walk around and we will treat people that way. So it's not enough just not to check the box and not murder anyone. And so it's not just keeping the rule, it's understanding why that was there in the first place. And lining yourself up with Jesus and saying, I want to view the world the way he does, and I want to live according to that. And I want my values to be his values. I want to care about what he cares about. And what he cares about is every person on the planet. And so as we unpack the rest of these statements that he makes, we will find again and again that Jesus drives us deeper, and he challenges us at areas that make us sometimes very uncomfortable. And there will be times when part of us says, yeah, but, and we'll make excuses for it. Why we can get off the hook. And that's what some of the rabbis and some of the teachers of religious law had done. They just simplified it, and Jesus is not. It's not that simple. If you know why the rules are there, if you know why those commandments are there, then you should live by that. And that is the value of every human life and the dignity of every person on the planet. And so as we process that, it'll be a little more complicated figuring out, well, what does that mean and how do I live that? But Jesus doesn't let us off the hook with just checking the box and no murder and just keeping the surface of the rule. He wants us to understand why it's there and live according to those principles rather than just the details of the law.